Welcome to Leaping the Abyss, a set of 7 podcasts hosted by Gail and Matt Taylor designed to help listeners think about their own agency and world perspective, and how individual ideas, values, actions, and beliefs help to shape and give life to the emerging paradigm, by design or default. Each of the 7 podcasts has a different interviewer, each familiar with the particular subject being explored. These roughly 30-minute interviews are more questions than answers, more nudging than perspective. For episode 6 of Leaping the Abyss, Gail and Matt discuss what's in your trunk with Catherine Stace.
Hi, Matt and Gail. It's so lovely to have a pleasure to interview you today. I've got a number of questions, probably too many, which is quite typical. However, let's start with the beginning of this particular piece, which is, is starting with a metaphysical concept before we become and create and co-design an artifact or, a design of a concept. And it starts with the vision. So it's easy for one person to have a vision. It's far more complex to have 12 people share that same vision and to then create a construct around processes and systems to create stewardship. So I think what we'd like to do is start with, what is a best case and a worst case scenario, because there are always risks of failure at every point. And to the people who are listening to this podcast, it would be really useful to know, without the right tools, how can we fail, and what do we need that are bare essentials, like the absolute must-haves when we're designing a new thing or artifact.
Great. So you have to say, well, what do I want to see? What is this vision? What's the best case? And you become familiar with it. You smell it, you sniff it, you work with it, you iterate it until you're kind of got something that you feel like you can, that's exciting. And you do the same with the worst case in a way. Well, if this gets away from me and if these kinds of things happen, what's the worst case?
In our work, we never impose a vision on anybody. Now, we have a vision for why we're doing it, all right? And we've talked to you about that before in our experience with you. You've seen that. There's an outcome that the group of people who are coming to work want to have, even though they may not know it exactly, but they're there to do something. And we're there to help them find that vision and execute it. Our vision is how they learn to work in a different way, in a collaborative way. And so we're demonstrating the application of our vision, but not talking about it. It's just a consequence. And the other thing about the best case and worst case is that it goes through multiple iterations. Yeah. It starts off with something which is nothing more than a tractor. And then as people get into it, it gets more and more specific, but it changes over time. And so that's part of the thing becoming organic. And so even for the people who've come and said, we want this to happen, what they will make happen ultimately will be different. But if it's done right, it'll be better.
It's so important to mention that, sorry, Gail, because when you're talking in corporate or even not-for-profit where I've worked, a strategy, once it's written, it's fixed, it's locked in stone, and you're held accountable to a piece of paper with a whole lot of thought on it. And it isn't allowing for iteration and to adapt or pivot to external environment or internal conditions. Can you talk to those points in context of best and worst case scenario?
I just want to go back for a moment because when I was describing best case, worst case, I was describing it for myself or for when Matt and I are planning. I wasn't doing it for a design shop outcome or something like that, which you jump to, which is, and it's of course useful at a very personal level as well as a large group in terms of setting up the design for how it will unfold. So multiple iterations are, so I'm sorry, I lost the track of the last question.
It's not really a question I had, but I think it's important to note that we're at odds, like when we've got that hierarchical control command style of you've got a mission, you've got the vision, the mission has to match the vision, you have to be measurable, and all of these sort of controls and constraints that are placed around a body of work. We have to, if we're looking at best case, worst case, and we're constantly iterating, we must look at how, I mean, it benefits a group to factor in failure, factor in iteration to mitigate failure. And what is failure? Because isn't failure just discovery? So, like, do we need to change how our fixed views on strategy, for example, on achieving goals and objectives are very sort of fixed, concrete constructs? So
that's not. Our model is organic, though, and so we have to think of it differently than that top-down control.
Yeah,
mechanism.
Exactly. So your model allows iterative, consensus, and that isn't just fixed from the beginning. It's all the way through. It provides that incredible stewardship, and I think that's a really important piece that's missing in a lot of strategy and a lot of potentially corporate, because there's profits involved, and profits make it a huge risk of failure. And so no one wants to fail, therefore they put things locked in concrete and timelines, and there's so much structure around it. It's really difficult, quite a rigid way of working. So I guess my question is, can you talk through how iterative processes mitigate risks of failure in real time? It's adaptive in real time. It's not like you have a 3-month post analysis of something when it's too late to pivot and change.
Our simple model, which seems simple, but it's not so simple, scan, focus, act. And when you get to act, you are going to come out with a plan. If you don't come out with a plan, you haven't come out with anything. And if it's a big project, it'll be a very elaborate piece of work with lots of details. But at the same time is that you're not going to, let's say you're building an airplane. What you know about that airplane by the time you commit, and you have preliminary costs, and you know what market you're putting it in, you know a lot about it. But that airplane will go through multiple evolutions and changes before it ever flies, and then before it ever gets to a customer, because of the complexity of it. But at any given time, the project work says, this is the project, this is what we're doing, and that. But part of that project is, we know we have to create a new kind of wing. We need that wing 2 years from now. We get to experiment and test, but everybody knows they want to deliver that wing at that time. And if they can't, then we have to make other adjustments. There's no thing of scale that can be done all at once, but it can be done through iterations and continuous improvement as you learn in the execution process. And that's actually the faster way.
Yeah, I led to a lot of continuous improvement, the Kaizen model, which is continuous improvement, which the model that Toyota use, which is, whenever you do something, is how can you improve, which is leaning into inquiry, isn't it? It's asking yourself questions at every point. Sorry, Gail, you're going to reach out then.
Well, I was just thinking that, the model, best case, worst case, is not at that planning process, that detail that you're talking about. It's actually, and it does go through multiple iterations. I like to think, I'm trying to think more like how nature does it. And of course, nature goes through iterations or phase transitions, state changes. So you have something that you've got to arrive at, as Matt talked about, 2 years from now. But you say, well, what are the beginning things that we have to assemble that allow us to know more and to learn the next the patterns and how to put it together. It's a very organic process, and it can be, it's I mean, it's 99% learning. When you have a detailed, like you talked about, everything's controlled, everything's deliverable, you don't have time to learn. You're too busy doing. And there, it's not going to be rich. And it's not going to be fun as it could be with a better design process. And part of that goes to your truck and what you have, the tools you have in your truck in order to realize a project, realize a vision, and what are the projects within that vision.
What tools are required for a best case outcome, no matter what the project is?
The definition of what's in the trunk is what you have to keep that can address the best case as it is currently stated and as it might evolve, and the worst case. You can't throw resources out. Well, we're going to go do this, so we don't need this anymore. We throw it away. And then you get drifting down towards a worst case situation. You don't have the capability to recover from that. So the trunk has to be full of alternative concepts, ideas, resources, possibly people, capital, maybe, all the things that it takes to do what you're doing. And it's going to be pretty fat in the beginning. And over time, as the thing starts to shape out, you can trim it down. Now, the thing here that's important, if you don't have the trunk and it goes another way, and maybe that other way is, wow, we got a better way of doing this, you've cut your feet off. Mm-hmm. If you keep everything in that trunk that you could possibly need, you won't be able to carry it up the mountain, and it won't be economical. You'll go broke. And so the art of the trunk is always keeping just the right amount of redundancy and resource and possibilities. And then as you go along, you can drop things off and add other things on. And so it's a very economic, not necessarily dollars and cents, but it's a very economic concept.
The other things that you carry in your trunk are your values and your ethics. Because if they're not there, you get to where you succeed, but you don't know what you're succeeding for. And suddenly now, oh, I've got all this money, but it doesn't have your ethics or your values in there. And so there's some things that you really need to let everybody can participate in building that trunk when you talk about a group of people. But it's explicit in terms of what's in this trunk that we want, the characteristics of the outcome that's going to enable our best case.
It's
what's going to happen?
Sorry, Matt.
What's going to happen with all those factors? There's going to be a continuous tug and pull, and that goes on in an organization anyway. But when it's done from a top down, hey, we said 6 months ago we were going to have these bolts here, and now we don't need bolts, but we're going to, if it's done in a top down way, you lose the veracity and the ability for it to evolve. So it's good to have that tug and pull. There'll be debates, there'll be questions, there'll be conflicts. People will have to argue it out from time to time in a big project over time. But that's healthy, that's creative.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, the story I really love about how nature creates. And so in creating a prairie, restoring a prairie, Packard, who was the scientist who was restoring a prairie, he had to get his soil right. And it took a while to figure out how to get the soil right and what was needed to get the soil right. But then he reached a phase transition where the birds and the insects and the animals, those very tiny animals, began coming. And so he went through another phase transition, and the larger animals came, and the plants grew, and the trees, the shrubs started growing, and all of this stuff. And so he goes through 4 or 5 different state changes until he realizes the prairie can't help but become a prairie, that he's got enough of the pieces in place that now what he has. And so he's got the process working. He had the process working with him. The process was telling him when he could go ahead, when he had to slow down, what he hadn't learned about how to do, because he knew how to go through these state changes. And I think a lot of our planning is about state changes, phase transitions in the development of a project. But we don't let that natural process happen. We try and control it with deadlines and other things.
I think it's incredibly important. In fact, one of the most profound times I had with one of your design shops was reading The Prairie and really understanding self-organizing systems properly. And I think we have to overlay that with time. And, I think that time provides pressure, because time equals money and equals resources and equals capacity, resource management. And so I think we've got generally a little bit stuck on the paradigm of time and equals money.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, if you draw the bow back very slowly to hit your target, you really hit your target the first time. You don't have to keep prototyping, although prototyping is essential. But I do find that the slow movement in design thinking, in design, for an emergence of the new is really essential. And we have to allow reflection and to gestate on things deeper. Otherwise, how can we be comprehensively considerate about what we're doing? How can we understand the unintended consequences of decisions and actions? So you make such an important point. The Prairie is something I encourage everyone to read, because it's powerful.
Yeah, he was lucky with the Prairie because he was the CEO and the gardener. And so he didn't have to deal with some of those other issues. Let me tell you a quick story that actually happened where the management of a major company actually did the right thing. You remember that Chrysler, had a big thing, and they finally got bailed out and they got back into business. But they really basically had one platform, and they were trying to make every car they had run off that one platform. And the whole industry was trashing them. You guys are okay, but you can't build a car from scratch anymore. You've lost it. You don't have the essence and everything. And they bought another company, which Jeep was part of. They wanted Jeep, and that helped them out. But they didn't know that this car company had had a new car, had designed a brand new car and had it all prototyped. And they wouldn't even go look at it. But finally, the guy in charge went and looked at it, and he saw this fantastically beautiful car. And he said, "How did you do this? You were going bankrupt. You had no resources. How did you do this car?" And the guy said, "Well, here was our method." And so Chrysler said, "Okay, we're going to try that." And so they decided, they went and they got a bunch of engineers and designers and people that could bend metal and everything, and they put them in this old factory they were no longer using, put them together, and they said, and they bought them a Cobra, which at the time was the big muscle car in the world, right? They bought them one and they stuck it in there. And they said, "You have to build a car like this." And he said, "This is your budget. Not one penny more. One penny more, the budget's gone, you're stopped. This is your time window, 2.5 years. That's it. All of you will be in the building together, every single person that has to build this car." And that's when they came out with their infamous muscle car. And it did everything they did. And what they were doing was prototyping a way of working. And I asked them at that point, I spent the whole day with them, this was years and years ago, and I said, "Why did you build a sports car?" And they said, "Because it was so easy to see if it made what we wanted. And we were broke and we were running out of money, but this is what we did. And then we took the process, and that's how we build every car from now on." And so management imposed limits
Yeah.
But management didn't get in there and tell these very competent people, well, I don't like that vendor, don't do that, don't do this, and everything. So they created freedom within limits with a process, and wham, and it put Chrysler back in business.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
important. And different from the Prairie, which is self-organizing system. That the car was not. It had self-organized. It had.
Well, yeah, but the
Yeah.
way that it was built was very self-organizing and very free from interference.
Johnny Ives talks about with Apple of just putting a blob in the middle of the table and saying, this is going to be an iPhone. And nobody had any idea what an iPhone was at that point. I mean, they had podcasts and stuff like this. And the conversation would go on a day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, as people were picking at, well, what does this blob look like? You know, and finally, Johnny said there was a moment in time where things began to cohere and a design began to emerge. And at that point, they could eliminate some things, and they had enough of the pattern that they were looking for that they could say, now we have a project. But all of that stuff is in my model of best case, worst case. It's that part of the model that we're looking at is before all of this detailed planning.
Yeah, I think it's important to move into people because, do we just bring a bunch of people together and let them self-organize, or is there more design around curating the people we work with in collaboration? How important is that? And can you talk through the best tools to curate and what you think about that?
It's very important, and it's a different system. And that's why it has to have a very high fiduciary duty presence, why it has to have extraordinary integrity. Because in a sense, a group like what we do to work with someone and they say, we want to build this airplane. We want to build a 777. That's the example of one of our projects. We want to do this. We want to do that. And we stand way back. And they tell us all the problems and questions they have and everything. And it's usually pretty accurate information. It's sometimes not well stated and it's all jumbled up. But they know a lot about their situation. Obviously, they wouldn't be even trying if they didn't know a lot. But we're standing back and looking at larger things. We're looking at, well, if you do this and this and this the normal way, you're going to get your airplane on the market a year and a half after Airbus's entry into the same marketplace. And it's going to be flying for a year or two before you ever get approval, and that's going to kill you. So we started defining the problem in different ways. And then when we set up the game of the 6 design shops that it took to get that 777 going, right? We were laying additional questions and problems and information and conditions on them, but we were never interfering with how to build the airplane or what the airplane ought to be. We were looking at the issues around it and surrounding it, and that could kill the project no matter how good the airplane was.
Which is another thing you need to have, no matter what, is what's going on in the world around you. And be very cognizant of that. And because systems are dying and collapsing, new things are happening. And today, and the complexity of creating anything, to have that larger frame, really important. When I think of the best case, worst case, I'm looking out, in my own experience, 10, 15, 20 years. And so I don't begin to know all the details or be able to map out. So it's a matter of iterations where I'm going along and getting feedback and learning what needs to happen next. And so, you have the vision, the there, but you're constantly working from here to there, learning what you need and now we are ready for this part of the process, and now we need to map it out. So this isn't for 6-month projects or things like that. In my mind, this is a living system that can take years to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going through state changes, you're going through cusp points of either or, you're shaping as you go. And this is the best case, worst case is a way to begin to monitor the behavior, the outcomes. System is what it does. You're learning, is this the system?
Can you talk about environments that shape behaviors that determine outcomes? Because when you change the environment, behaviors can change as well.
Yeah.
And for a best case scenario, which we all want, what environments are optimum for behaviors?
Neutral,
but exciting.
Yeah.
So when we developed one company wanted to move from 2 years. They thought their cycle of idea to marketplace was too long, and they wanted to shorten that. It was 2 years at that point. And they wanted to shorten it by a few months. And I said, you don't need us for that. We're not interested in that. We finally got down to where they said, okay, they'd shorten it to 12. They'd cut it in half and do 12 months. And I said, okay, this is worth working on. Well, what they discovered in the design process is that when they all came together, they brought all the different pieces together and they set up their own space for this project, which had all the different components in it. The salesmen were there, the designers were there, the market was there, the clients were brought in, the whole thing. The iterations went like that because everybody was in the game. In the tide pool is what they named it, because it came out of an aha of how important tide pools are, because they're time-based and they're very, very, very nutrient rich in the beginning. But if you don't get out, it dies. The whole project dies in their metaphor, And so that's when they said, oh, we're going to create a tide pool space, and we know what our timing is. We know we have to get in, we know we have to get out, but we have to do it according to the flow and the moon and all of these different things. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, the one thing that's interesting also is that in every one of these very large projects that we did, when I say very large, billions in consequence, with an airplane or with a F-15 or something like that, it's huge amounts of money that are at risk. And failure is very bad. It's not just losing money. What's interesting is there's usually just 2 or 3 little things, little decisions that can have huge impacts. Maybe the biggest impact on delivery time or cost or both that's there. And it's difficult to be in the design process and to see those things. Now, they themselves will bring the issues up unknowingly most often, or they'll bring it up and say, well, we really can't deal with that now. And whoever's facilitating, whoever's guiding this process, and it's difficult to do this internally, is standing back and saying, yeah, but if this doesn't happen, then what will happen over here is they'll lose 2 years in their delivery. And you go to them and say, you got to do this. Look at this. Work on this. No, work on it. That's where you have to be a little bit of a push on the thing, because when you're in it, it's very difficult to see those little things that actually can destroy a project or accelerate it enormously.
You've got like little decisions or little things can make large consequences, and that comes back to Bucky's comprehensively considerate about all that we do and working as a whole system rather than siloed. And what Gail is saying is you've got to provide the right space, environment, and conditions for people to feel trusted and safe in collaboration, to be able to open up. And, you know, the values and ethics are thrown into that as well. I love that the title, so divine. And what Matt's saying, it all links together, is like when you make a decision, it's consensus rather than directive, even though you have to put focus on it. But then I would also add that we need, can you talk about prototyping and frequency and flow? Because, you know, you can have the right people, the right conditions, the right environment, but how do you foster a culture of flow and focus and prototyping as part of the iterative process? Gail?
You know, one thing I'll say about that is it's a paradox. It's so natural that all you have to do is to take out for a period of time the things that kill flow. And bang. You don't make it, you don't cause it, you don't preach it, you don't teach it. You put them in an environment, and as you know, in a design shop, you know, we control it a lot at the beginning, but about halfway through, it's taken on its own thing. And at the end, everyone's working, we're taking notes, right? We bring no influence in that latter part. But in the beginning part, we've set up the game.
Yeah.
And then when people get in the game, it's fantastic. It's so simple.
So our producer is telling us we're out of time, and it's gone so fast. But I do want to.
Yeah,
I want to say. I want to add one thing, which is in a way another subject. I'm part of Humanity Rising right now, which is getting about 11,000 people a day listening, and it's going every day with different stories, different unfoldings. But the intent is to create a large enough field and a large enough energy and self-organizing in many ways to actually make this multiple try over time escape, you know, because with the pandemic, which was like a fire, and, you know, the moment Humanity Rising said, this is our moment, let's go for it. And so all kinds of projects are worthy of this kind of exploration. The airplane, the big projects that we've done, but also the more organic projects that are big in scale and trying to create a new paradigm, a new way of working, of how that all gets coordinated.
Yeah, but while we're here, I'd like to get your story, because we can work it into the time. Get your story, because in a sense, what you did through what was a terribly negative thing, you pulled something out of that you were able to make some rather spectacular changes quickly, because you used that experience in a positive way rather than a negative way. And I know you mentioned this a little bit before when we were just talking, but could you give us kind of a little outline of how you did that? Because I think that's a very, it's an example of what we've been talking about. Only in this case, you did it in your own mind, your own organization, your own mind, your own life. And then out of that came things working with other people that were effective.
Sure. So I was CEO of Cure Brain Cancer Foundation, and we had your design shop, which really opened up minds of scientists and clinicians and patients. And I saw and I felt focus and flow through the environments and the process that we were taken on. And so when you've experienced something like that, it is life-changing. It always stays with you. And even before that, I did a design shop with Transform Australia, and there were some defining moments in that as well, where Elena Bonadevera said we have to ask questions. if we don't ask questions, how we're going to stay stuck in the paradigms and the status quo. So it's really important when you're curing brain cancer that we ask questions, because clearly whatever's been working hasn't worked, otherwise we'd have a cure. So to collaborate with people and to provide diverse thinking and to really lean into people and listen and take that time out of doing and being the busy bees and looking productive when you might be really busy raising funds, but you're not achieving the mission. And there's often a big gap between productivity and the purpose. So it's really creating that beautiful red thread of purpose in our work. And so, Cure Brain Cancer and became a global effort and is now into phase 2 and 3 clinical trials for patients. So, this is changing the game for brain cancer patients, and it then has ripple effects to other cancers and other diseases. So overlay that narrative with me coming down with Lyme disease and falling very ill very suddenly and unexpectedly. And in Australia, we don't have access to doctors or treatment. So I'm stuck in a body that's no longer functioning. So this was my worst case scenario, almost worst case scenario. So for me, it was, there's clearly a need. So that became my purpose, is to using all the tools and resources and the knowledge and the insight and the intrinsic quality is so important around compassion and bringing love to everything that you do and with the people you're working with. Because that holds the safest container of all to provide stewardship, and it's genuine. So to have all of these skills and apply it to building a global network in Lyme disease, which started off as Lyme disease, but it's now microbes, because the more we researched and questioned and talked to scientists and patients, the more we started to link a system, an ecosystem of microbes. It's not one thing. We're not mono disease anymore. We are multi-complex systemic diseases that can happen to people and is happening more often. And so we started to investigate microbes and then map the system of clinicians and scientists, research groups across the spectrum. So what started off in Lyme disease has moved into cancer and Alzheimer's research and MS and dementia, all types of mold, chronic fatigue syndrome. We're working with all of these people now, and people being, we've got 15 research teams across US, China, France, Germany, and Australia. And a lot of this was done from my bedroom, me in bed feeling as sick as a dog without any way out. But really what motivates me is the curiosity of we have a problem to solve, we have a purpose to help patients, and there's a better way than relying on pill poppings, and we have to look at cause, not symptoms. So that's all of this is as a result of learning about the prairie and understanding collaboration and how to curate people and looking at iterative processes and how to have that flow state. And that flow state is only ever happens when there's authenticity of the people you're working with as well. It's incredibly important. So I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but that's...
I think that's a beautiful story, and I think it's demonstration of what the work is really about, which is creating the ability for something like that to happen, and how you took your prior experiences and overcame something that could really quite devastating, and turned it into another cycle that and took this thing which people really didn't even want to talk about, and turned and recreated it and redefined it and redefined the issue of what it actually is, and turned it into, well, all these things are part of this, and this is where we need to be working. So you took it all the way up to a system.
I have to say it's a collaboration, and there's been Professor George Gierman. You have to have people who believe, because I have to say, cognitive bias, the resistance of the new is so powerful, and it stops people progressing. Denial of people often generally have cognitive dissonance, even like around something that a new concept. So much denial around let's keep the status quo. There's a protection there. So to have people believe that what I was experiencing is true, and it's not made up or a pseudo illness, and then to have Professor Jimin, who I knew, so there was already mutual trust between us, and someone of influence and huge, beautiful reputation. So that's important as well. It wasn't me, myself. It was me seeding what I've learned and bringing together the teams using the tools that I have been taught and learned along the way. Yeah.
We could go on for hours. We always say that, but
I know. I didn't really get all my questions, I have to say, but I really wanted to talk about signals and the red thread, but that will have to, and the whole person. I love the whole person. Oh.
Yeah, the whole person. All right. We'll get them another time.
There's going to be another one.
Much love to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Don't miss the final interview in the Leaping the Abyss series, Creating Scaffolding with Carolyn Buckloose. You can always find more information on the series by visiting bodyofknowledge.online.